Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I'm going to go through the top 10 questions I've received in the comments for making all of these videos about SSD upgrades for PS5. If you have been following this channel, you know that I've been putting out loads and loads and loads of videos where I've been going through both the beta software and the full release software for the PS5 in the ability to add SSD upgrades to the system, thereby giving you more storage capacity and in some cases improving the performance, something we'll touch on later on. And throughout that time, lots of questions have been asked, and I've been sort of correlating them and putting them together into basically the top 10 questions that you guys have asked throughout the last couple of months. Now, a lot of these questions, it have to be said, seem more obvious than others. First and foremost, I've been working in the field of data storage for more than a decade, but I know not everyone has. And a lot of people are having to get their brains around this new kind of storage. You know, we aren't talking like the difference between memory cards and a PS1. We're talking about the difference between hard drives, SSDs, and whatever the hell you guys think these are. SSDs or NVMe SSD upgrades that take advantage of PCIe Gen 4 connectivity are a completely different kettle of fish in terms of their architecture, their components, and their just overall build. And a lot of people have either been told stuff that isn't true, or they've held on to beliefs and understandings of hard drives and SSDs from just as little as 3 or 4 years ago, which are just not true anymore. So today I'm going to go through those top 10 questions that have all come from you. A lot of you who have been upgrading the SSD on your PS5 have, quite sensibly gone for the biggest possible drives that are out there, like this one. This is the 4TB Brent SSD. It doesn't come cheap, but it's 4 terabytes of storage that you can upgrade on your PS5. However, a lot of you were very keen to highlight that these SSDs have got chips on either side of the board. There's chips on the top, chips on the bottom. However, once you install one of these inside a heatsink like these bad boys here, you started to notice that the heatsink on the top, despite the fact that the heatsink on the top is very, very thick, nice big thick heatsink there, the base of this heatsink was incredibly thin. And a lot of you were worried that the base of this heatsink was not going to deliver anywhere near the dissipating cooling on the base of that SSD as it inevitably would at the top. So should you be worried about that base level of the SSD? And I'm here to tell you no. When it comes to a two-sided SSD, it's worth highlighting with these SSDs, of course, that although there are chips on either side, those chips aren't all equal. On the top of the SSD, lying underneath that label there is one big chip known as the controller, which you can think of as the CPU or the brains of the SSD. There is little modules of memory, or SDRAM or DRAM, and this is kind of acting as an on-the-flow buffer on the SSD when it's handling data. But the biggest and most copious chip is known as NAND. These are cells where the data lives. They'll generally be in little quadrants of gigabytes, and these make up the overall capacity on this SSD. Now, the controller on the top needs to be as cool as possible to work at its best. The cooler that controller is on the top, the better the device will run. NAND, on the other hand, works better when it's warm. Not boiling hot, but warm. And it actually is ideal for an SSD like this to make sure that the NAND, where that data lives, is warm. It's ready to access. And therefore, that's why in almost all cases on the bottom of an SSD, you'll only find the NAND. Maybe one of the memory chips to make space, but generally you only find the NAND. And therefore, the base of this plate doesn't need to have the aggressive heat dissipation of the top. So don't worry about thicker SSDs that have got chips on both sides. Just make sure you use a SSD heatsink that's got that little plate underneath that can hold on to some of that thermal padding there on the base. It's a good question. Does the plate that's covering the M2 SSD slot inside the PS5 actually matter? For those that aren't aware, we are talking about this plate right here. That SSD plate is where your M2 NVMe lives, and inside there is the connector that connects the SSD to the main internal console. That's known as the M2 slot there, and that slot, if we pop that lid there, We can have a look inside. There is our M2 NVMe slot. Now, a lot of you have wondered since the very early days how important it is to keep this covered, because this plate here covers on top, and therefore the SSD is inside and contained. Now, some SSDs, like the one I've shown you there, fit very, very neatly inside there. So other SSD heatsinks, like the big chunky Sabrent, this one here, this big chunky one here, will not allow you to fit on the plate. So, should you worry about not having that plate on there? Yes and no. First and foremost, the design of the PS5 takes advantage of something called negative pressure. The idea is that when the airflow is being moved around this system, this contained and closed area will create a vacuum in there to help air pass through it very, very quickly and maintain that temperature. Testing from companies including Sabrent as well have noticed that with internal temperature checks in here, even without an SSD inside that slot, it was around 10 degrees hotter inside there. So in order to facilitate that coolness, you're going to need a heatsink, but also that active airflow and negative pressure to maintain that airflow throughout it is going to be quite useful. However, we have also done our own testing where we've taken advantage of a heatsink like this inside this slot without the cover on board, and the ambient temperature around it wasn't that effective. Now, it's still early days, and I won't say that it's going to invalidate your warranty by any regard, but right now, having that plate on or not is really going to come down to whether you are utilising a heatsink that's too big. I don't believe personally that a heatsink that is slightly larger in there is going to disrupt the flow of the system. That negative pressure that has been mentioned applies to that slot and the active airflow throughout the system. It is not going to block air being moved around that fan and out those vents. At the very least, what you're going to end up with is a situation where this heatsink is going to be containing all of that heat, and the air is still going to pass over it. It's just not going to take advantage of the contained vacuum airflow all the way through it. So basically you're getting one advantage and one disadvantage either way you travel at it. Overall, I would still recommend that you get a heatsink that allows you to put the slot on, or one like the Sabrent PS5 design one that covers the entire cavity. But if you're not able to get a heatsink that fits, that doesn't mean it's the end of the world using a larger heatsink that stops you using that plate. Very common one this. Should you remove the labels on your SSD before you install it inside? A number of you may be tempted when you buy your SSD to remove the label that covers those NAND chips. Now, in some cases when you buy an SSD, and again I've noticed this with some of the more enterprise level drives, if you remove that sticker it will invalidate your warranty. Brands have been very, very clear about this, and in some cases when you remove the label it will show the word void being imprinted across those chips, and you've completely knackered your warranty. Now, most modern brands now factor in the labels onto their SSDs. The early days of M2 NVMe SSDs, things were not that straightforward, and people did indeed need to remove those labels. But much more modern release SSDs do not require these labels to be removed. They don't interfere with the heatsink. In some cases, again, to highlight Sabrent again, some companies actually factor the label into their dissipation, utilising aluminium plates there to assist with the heat dissipation with the thermal padding. The very fact you're using the thermal padding will already work in tandem with a heatsink. So don't worry about removing the labels on your SSD, not only because it's already been factored into the design and not a problem, but also because in many, many cases it will completely invalidate the warranty on your drive. Let's face it, in 2021, and indeed the decade that came before it, we are very used to firmware updates. We're a big software-optimized group of people, and ultimately, firmware updates are just either tweaking things, making them better, or, in some cases, something that's not been released in its fullest version. Whatever way you look at it, firmware updates are generally always a good thing, generally. Now, in the case of SSDs for your PS5, I'm afraid to say you cannot update the firmware on an SSD from within this system. There have been a few examples. One of the keenest ones is this, the ADATA XPG. If you own one of these, do know that the default firmware, that if it was released anywhere before, I believe, August 17th or 27th, that firmware isn't as good as the latest firmware. And if you install it on there, this drive has improved performance. Now, because you can't do the firmware update inside the PS5, how to get hold of it? Well, you are going to have to utilize a PC with an M2 NVMe slot inside. On the plus side, it doesn't have to be Gen 4 like super new. You can get one of the older generation M2 slots and plug it in. It will mean that the performance will be massively bottlenecked, but that really is the only way that you can update the firmware. Or maybe an external dock, if you can get hold of one like a USB external dock. These normally retail for about 20-30 quid. So again, not the cheapest, but nonetheless, updating the firmware on the SSD is necessary, but you cannot do it on a PS5. So find a friend who's got a PC that can help you out with that if you don't already have one. Once again, heatsinks rear their ugly head again. Should you always utilize the proprietary first-party heatsink on an M2 NVMe inside your PS5, or should you go for an SSD with no heatsink and then utilize a third-party one? This is our Heatsinks heatsink again. Do recommend this bad boy. It's been used in a lot of my testing. I have to say, in almost all cases, you should go, where possible, for the first-party heatsink. There are a lot of very good third-party heatsinks on the market that you can get for about 10 to 15 nicker, but first-party heatsinks, it's not just that you're saving a bit of time. It's because in many cases, when you get a first-party SSD with inclusive heatsink, they are doing the application. So that could mean several things. First and foremost, it is the idea that they will apply the heatsink and the thermal pads inside, those pads that we saw inside the Heatsinks. They do that in an air-controlled environment at factory level and with a greater deal of precision. So again, precision is the key word, because the second point is, if you remember our question from the beginning about making sure that certain components get cooler than others, when SSD heatsinks are applied at the factory level, they will often make sure that the heatsink, the thermal pads inside, are specifically applied to each of the components that need them. They'll be custom cut or directly applied. I know it's very hard to make out here, but you can see a little grey line there. That is a thermal pad on top of one of the key components. They're not utilizing one giant thermal pad that's covering all of the chips. They're making sure that they centralize and isolate the chips that need the best cooling. It's far more efficient and it makes a lot more sense. Now, I said almost always the case, because in some cases, like with the Sabrent over here, if you buy a Sabrent SSD and heatsink combo, they still ship them separately. So you have to do your own application there, which kind of undermines the whole them doing it for you and making sure the whole thing's done in one bundle. Yes, third-party heatsinks are good, and there are other ones as well I've linked to in the description that are very good heatsinks. And in some cases, you will buy an SSD that doesn't include, like the Titanium series, that don't include a first-party heatsink with them. So in some cases, you have to go down that road. But where possible, unless it's ludicrously expensive, more than about $20 to $30 tops, always go for the first-party heatsink. But double check that it is applied by them, and you can always tell the ones that are applied, they will show pictures of it being applied to the device. Wow, this one's a biggie. Whether you're watching this the day it's been published or you're watching this video a few weeks or months from now, there's a very good chance that the SSD that you've decided that you wanted to buy, whether it's from my videos or any other resource online, you've gone straight through to checkout and it's not available. It's out of stock. They'll have them in 7 days. They'll have them in 2 weeks. They'll have them in 3 months. Why is the SSD that you want to buy not available right now? Now, a lot of people will shout at you, oh, the scalpers, they won't let us get hold of PS5s, and now they're holding on to all the SSDs. It's not the case. It's not the same as trying to buy an SSD, as trying to buy a PS5. SSD sales are far more broad than just PS5s, and a number of you may not have been aware of the last 18 months to 2 years in the world of SSDs. Get comfortable. In the last 2 years or so, the following has happened. Obviously, the pandemic has affected the way people have worked in their work environments, and this has massively affected the East, who were one of the earliest regions to be, to get hold of COVID, and with that they had to change their working patterns very quickly, and therefore the supply chain was massively affected to the rest of the world. Not just because of those changing working practices, but then you ended up in countries like Taiwan where there were massive droughts. The production of a lot of the key components, one of which we'll talk about in a moment, that are used in the development of SSDs needs a lot of water in its production, and Taiwan was suffering massive droughts due to not having the filtration plants to get the clean enough water to produce these components. One of those big components, of course, let's all say it together, semiconductors. If you've not heard the word semiconductor on the news, you're not watching the right news channels. Semiconductors have been in shortages for years. It's because it's all basically produced out in the East, and although other parts of the world have started producing semiconductors, they're nowhere near to the same scale as it is still in the east of the world. And with the production of semiconductors largely benefiting not just SSDs, but everything from home computers to phones to cars and more, semiconductor production for different kinds of semiconductors is very much guided by and tied to buying trends by consumers. And the pandemic, one of its biggest impacts on that was buying patterns change. Generally at the start of the year, car sales are very, very good. But then this year, of the 2020 year, car sales were terrible all the way into 2021. And all that production that would have gone into semiconductors towards that had to be rerouted, and a lot of change of factory labor, a lot of changes of hardware in between. And then of course it went to home computer devices because people were working from home, but then people started coming in and out of lockdowns at different stages and different times, and the impact of the pandemic was very, very different. The result was that the semiconductor market was just, oh God, what the hell is going on? And everyone was struggling to keep up, and therefore the already existing shortages in semiconductors only got worse. Now, this was further impacted by a cryptocurrency called Chia, which rather than utilizing graphics cards and stuff like that, prioritized storage media, where you would have a small batch of very fast SSDs and a large batch of very large capacity hard drives working together to plot and farm this cryptocurrency, which massively impacted the hard drive and SSD market at the end of 2020 and early 2021, as Chia was first spoken about and then introduced. Fast forward, there was, of course, rewind. Back in, I believe, 2019, there was the US-China trade war, Huawei and stuff like that getting involved. And again, this massively bottlenecked and harmed a lot of the hardware market. And one of the biggest victims year on year on years have been SSDs. Now, the recovery, they say, hasn't even happened yet, all the way into 2022, potentially even 2023 for both SSDs and hard drives. And although it's very easy for us to sort of lean back and go, oh yeah, there's no SSDs, the scalpers, it really isn't the case with SSDs. This has been a pre-existing problem for a long time, and it is going to affect SSDs. So don't be surprised if shortages continue in SSDs, and if you are looking to upgrade the SSD on your hard drive, make sure you've got a second and third choice. Will games load faster on SSDs rather than on the internal PS5? Now, the argument now is a bit yes and no, but as time wears on, definitely games are going to load faster on these. Let's explain. The internal SSD of the PlayStation 5, extensive testing have put that benchmark around the 5,000 mark. They did report a lot of speeds there at early presentations for the PS5, I believe at 5.5 gigabytes, but gigabytes per second, or 5,500 megabytes per second. However, more testing has kind of put it somewhere between 5,000 and 500 due to a lot of the performance benchmarks being very, very hard to do externally on this system. However, a lot of these SSDs hit performance benchmarks of 7,000 and higher. And at the moment, games development is taking advantage of the hardware inside this system. And although obviously the kind of architecture of these games from creatives and publishers and developers and stuff are going to take advantage of the system as is, and they're going to draw whatever they can from it in terms of SSD. The optimization of the SSDs as games are getting produced for these bigger open worlds mean that eventually the kind of development bottleneck of creating games around the internal SSD here is going to be largely irrelevant, as they eke more out of that 5.5 gigabytes per second performance, and with the more efficient wrangling of that performance, it will in turn give way to being able to take advantage of the larger performance in excess of 7,000. I think the highest at the moment is 7,400 megabytes per second. It cannot physically exceed 8,000 due to the lane that these SSDs use, known as PCIe Gen 4x4. However, back to the original question, right now, these SSDs will load some games faster the internal SSD, as our videos over the last few weeks have proven. But as time wears on, newer games are definitely going to take advantage of that performance increase. Does SSD write speed matter in the PS5? This is a very intriguing point, because when it comes down to it, right now, the answer is no. It's nice and simple. Even with the release of the PS5 beta software in full public release, right now, a lot of the things that this SSD is capable of putting out, you can't really take advantage of. Read performance is largely the priority overall, with very little write activity happening on the SSDs. But as time wears on and the software and services of the PS5 are no longer restricted to just the internal SSD, I'm talking about live recordings, I'm talking about streaming and broadcasting and stuff like that, then chances are the write performance on these SSDs is going to start to matter. Now, again, I don't know when that's going to be. But if you look at the way games are being developed, if you look at a lot of these creative worlds that you have an impact on, and definitely games where you have an element of control and creation on them, that write speed is going to start to matter, particularly with a lot of the streaming services. And if you are in any way recording games as you go, or moving data to and fro, write of course is going to matter. But right now, it doesn't really matter. The only reason I talk about write a lot in my videos is, one, I think people do overlook how write performance can matter later down the line, and overall how people are restricting themselves in some cases, thinking I'm never going to use write, when ultimately it may become something that becomes a factor later on. And if it doesn't become a factor, what's the price difference? 10, 20, 30 quid? Who cares? This is a weirdly common question, i.e., can you use PCIe Gen 3 SSDs inside your PS5 system? Now, I say it's a weird question because I've made 3 videos on this subject. The answer is unresoundingly no, you cannot use PCIe Gen 3 SSDs inside the PS5. I know they're a lot cheaper per terabyte. I know they still put out some pretty impressive performance of around 3,500 megabytes per second. You're thinking, why can't I use it? That's not fair. If you try to put one of these inside the PS5, when you boot the system up, it just flat out tells you you're using a drive that is not fast enough for this system. You need to use a PCIe Gen 4, get it out the system, it won't boot. So do yourself a favour, don't try, okay? If you try to put in Gen 3 SSDs in this system, you're wasting your time. But moreover, you might be buying something that's going to be useless to you, and you won't be able to return it because you broke the seal. Just do yourself a favour, don't even try. PCIe Gen 3 M2 NVMe's do not work. Yes, this is a really silly one, and one that's only really spiked while I've been doing the comparison videos. But in my first video, when I wanted to highlight that this was my PS5, talking about how, of course, this is mine, I'm one of those knobbers that puts plates on it, I didn't realise just how many of you would actually do this, okay? I thought I was the weirdo, and it turns out we're all weirdos. But yes, this isn't a one-off thing that I purchased. If you do want to turn your PS5 into a kind of moody PS2 release, what you can do, there are people out there that are selling PS2 mod kits way above the asking price. They're asking for like close to 100 quid. Do not pay those people. The black plate is I'll try and link to this in the description. If it's not live on the day of this video, I'll try and link to it in the next day or so, my shopping basket. But the outside plate here, it's a matte black plate. I picked it up on Amazon, not even 20 quid. I think it was like 25 pounds. Again, prices may change. The side labels came from an eBay shop, and again, you can get the PS5 logo there. I will link into the description. And of course, this tiny little 99 pence PlayStation sticker there on the front. And there you go. That is how to turn your PlayStation 5 into a moody, fake-looking PS2. It's a silly question, but you guys did ask a lot. But this has been my top 10 questions that you guys have sent me on SSD storage upgrades and the PS5. If there are more questions, if there are more unique questions, or if you've got ones that I've not answered previously, bung them in the comments. We may make another video. But thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, click like. If you want to learn more or stay abreast of all these videos to do with data storage, Thunderbolt, DAS, NAS, and more, as well as, of course, PS5 SSDs and hard drives, then do click subscribe and click the notification bell there. And of course, there are links to all of the products that I've gone through today, be it with this bloody thing or the actual SSDs, linked to in the description below. So do check those out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.